Hi, this is the recording to accompany the slides for the second of 2 lectures on the respiratory system. Let's begin. So in this lecture, what we're going to cover is we're going to cover the mechanics of breathing in terms of pulmonary ventilation, air coming in and out, external and internal respiration, so gas exchange both at the level of the pulmonary capillaries as well as the systemic capillaries. What controls breathing? And in the midst of it, we're going to look at several different laws and effects, including Boyle's, Dalton's, and Henry's laws and the Haldane effect. And we're going to focus a little bit more on gas exchange and transport with respect to oxygen and carbon dioxide and how they actually bind to or associate with hemoglobin and how they get dissociated or let go from the hemoglobin. So we're going to cover each of these diagrams more in depth as we progress through the lecture. So in terms of the process of breathing, we've got ventilation. And the pulmonary, in terms of the principle of ventilation or pulmonary ventilation, what needs to happen, what drives or what allows pulmonary ventilation to occur is a pressure gradient. So we need to have a pressure gradient, a gas pressure gradient, and so that air moves from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. And what we need to do is create that difference in pressures between what is outside in the atmosphere and what is inside in our lungs. And we need to actually ensure that that there is a pressure gradient, so air always moves from high pressure to lower pressure. And so when we talk about inspiration or inhalation, in that process, air moves into the lungs. So if we look at air moving from higher to lower pressure, what it means is that the pressure outside the lungs, typically called atmospheric pressure, needs to be higher than the pressure inside the lungs, typically called intrapulmonary or intraalveolar pressure. And so if atmospheric pressure is higher than intraalveolar pressure, then air goes from the atmosphere outside to the alveoli inside. When we breathe out through a process called expiration or exhalation, we need the reverse to occur. So in expiration, we need the pressure inside the lungs to be higher than the pressure outside the lungs. And so then air moves from inside the lungs to outside, higher to lower, right? So when we talk about breathing, there are 4 different pressures that we need to consider. So the first pressure is atmospheric pressure. And atmospheric pressure is defined as air pressure of the atmosphere. So external pressure outside of the body's airways. At a given, it's constant at a given location. At sea level, it is 760 millimeters mercury. So that really doesn't change, right? Because we can't change the pressure of the air outside unless we go to a different spot in the world. The second pressure is intraalveolar or intrapulmonary pressure. So that's a pressure inside our alveoli and the pressure inside of our lungs. So that is depicted as P alveoli here. The third pressure is called intrapleural pressure or intrathoracic pressure. And so this is, you remember the pleura is the 2 membranes. We've got the visceral pleura that is stuck onto the outside surface of the lungs, and we've got the parietal pleura that's stuck to the internal side of the thoracic cavity. And in between, we've got the pleural space. There's fluid inside of the pleural space, and so there's pressure in that pleural space, and that pressure inside the pleural space is called intrapleural or intrathoracic pressure. As it says here in the highlights, it's always less than atmospheric pressure and alveolar pressure. And because it's less, it's negative pressure, and that negative pressure helps to stick the lungs to the thoracic cavity. And so what happens is if the lungs are stuck to the thoracic cavity, that actually means that as the thoracic cavity expands, right, becomes bigger, what happens is it also pulls the lungs together with it. And then as the thoracic cavity gets smaller, then it can push the lungs to become smaller. And that helps create that pressure gradient between the atmosphere and inside of the lungs or the alveoli. And then we've got transpulmonary pressure, which is the difference between intrapleural pressure as well as alveolar pressure, and that determines the lung size, right? Pressure values are discussed in relation to atmospheric pressure over here. So when we talk about a negative pressure, it means pressure that's lower than atmospheric pressure. We talk about positive pressure, it's pressure that's greater than atmospheric pressure. We talk about zero pressure, it's pressure that's equal to atmospheric pressure. So if you have atmospheric pressure over here, and if atmospheric pressure is higher than alveolar pressure, then what happens is air goes from the atmosphere into the alveoli. If atmospheric pressure is lower than alveolar pressure, then the air goes from high to low. So the air in the second instance goes from from the alveoli out into the atmosphere, right? And so the first one here is breathing in, inspiration or inhalation, right? Because air moves into the lungs. The second one is breathing out. So expiration or exhalation. So air moving out. And over the rest of the lecture, we'll see what can drive the changes in alveolar pressure. Because again, atmospheric pressure is constant at a given location. So we can't change atmospheric pressure, but we can change alveolar pressure so that it becomes either higher or lower than atmospheric pressure to drive air movement. So we'll talk about the first law. So the first law that we're going to talk about is Boyle's law. And Boyle's law states that the volume of gas varies inversely with its pressure at a constant temperature. So that if you have here, if you think about these molecules here, like these gas molecules over here, and you think about this container. So in container 1 and in container 2, you have the same number of gas molecules, but you can see here, container 2, the volume is lower, and in container 1, the volume is higher, right? Boyle's law says that the pressure inside is inversely proportional to the volume. So as the volume increases, what happens is the pressure decreases, right? As the volume in container 2 decreases, pressure increases. So this is what happens to alveolar pressure. We can't change the pressure in the atmosphere, but we can change the volume in our lungs by making our lungs smaller or bigger. And when we make our lungs smaller or bigger, we change the volume and then we change the pressure in the opposite way. Right? So that's what happens. So you've got, and we can change the volume of the lungs by changing the size or volume of the thoracic cavity. Because as I said, the lungs are stuck to the thoracic cavity. So as the thoracic cavity enlarges, then the volume of the lungs enlarges, the pressure inside of the lungs goes down, right? So let's do this. So in the first point down below, for inspiration to occur, air needs to move into the lungs. So the pressure in the lungs needs to be relatively smaller than the pressure outside. And so you have atmospheric pressure in this case is greater than alveolar pressure. And so what happens is air then moves from outside to inside the lungs. In the second point, what happens is that for expiration to occur, what we need is that expiration is when air moves out of the lungs. So the pressure inside the lungs, the alveolar pressure, needs to be relatively higher than the pressure in the atmosphere. So what we have over here is atmospheric pressure is lower relative to alveolar pressure. And so air moves from high to low. So in this case, air moves from the lungs to the external environment. And so that's exhalation or expiration. So what we need to do is we need to enlarge the chest cavity and decrease the chest cavity in order to provide changes in alveolar pressure. As you can see here in ventilation, so the process of air moving in and out of the lungs, what happens is the lungs are passive and they passively expand and contract because they're stuck by virtue of the pleural fluid in the pleural cavity to the thoracic cavity. So as the thoracic cavity is expanded, then the lungs also expand. As the thoracic cavity contracts, the lungs also contract, right? The amount of resistance to airflow depends on the diameter of the airway of the bronchioles. So, when the bronchioles are smaller, then less air can go in. When the bronchioles are bigger, more air can go in. So the bronchioles stay small due to parasympathetic innervation via the vagus, and it gets bigger, bronchodilation, when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, right, through the T2, T4 sympathetic ganglion. Another thing that affects ventilation is the surface tension within the alveoli. So we talked about how we've got surfactant that's produced by type 2 alveolar cells or septal cells, and they reduce surface tension to make it easier for the alveoli to expand and after they've been contracted. This determines how easy it is to breathe in. Next thing is the thoracic wall compliance, so how easy your chest cavity expands and contracts. So that also then determines the ease of inspiration. If we have decreased compliance of the thoracic wall, it means that it's harder for the chest to actually increase in size and decrease with every breath. And so it means that it's harder for air to actually move in. Last factor in this list is elastic recoil. So elastic recoil is like a rubber band. When you let go, it shrinks back to its original size. And so elastic recoil is a tendency for pulmonary tissues to return to a smaller size after it's been stretched. And so this determines how easy it is to breathe air out or expiration. When we look at pulmonary ventilation, so the movement of air in and out of the lungs, again, as I said, there needs to be a pressure gradient in the air outside, the atmospheric air versus the air inside, alveolar air, right? So a respiratory cycle is defined as one sequence of breathing in, inspiration, and breathing out, expiration. As I said before, inspiration occurs when atmospheric pressure is higher than alveolar pressure, so air moves from outside the lungs to inside the lungs. And this happens when the diaphragm contracts. So you see over here, this is the diaphragm. When it contracts, it becomes flatter. And when it becomes flatter, then the chest cavity increases in size. When the chest cavity increases in size, volume is inversely proportional to pressure. So over here, as the volume of the chest cavity increases, then the pressure inside of the chest cavity decreases, right? So air moves in. Sometimes we also have the external intercostal muscles contract to lift the rib cage even bigger, so that the volume increases even more and the pressure drops even more. But in which case, whether it's just the diaphragm that contracts or it's the diaphragm and the internal intercostals, volume still increases, pressure still decreases below atmospheric pressure, and so air moves from outside to inside the lungs. Expiration is the opposite process. So in expiration, what happens is the diaphragm relaxes, right? And so the volume inside of the chest cavity decreases, right? The external intercostal muscle relaxes, the volume decreases, and when the volume decreases, then the pressure increases. And so the pressure inside is alveolar pressure, and it increases so that it's higher than atmospheric pressure. And so what you can see here that happens is that because alveolar pressure is greater than atmospheric pressure, then air goes from the lungs to the external environment, right? And so this is a process of breathing out, expiration, or exhalation. And so one cycle of inspiration followed by expiration is called a respiratory cycle. Now we've got quiet breathing as well as deep breathing. So quiet breathing occurs at rest, does not acquire the cognitive thought of the individual. So that means that quiet breathing occurs when we're not thinking about it, when we're sleeping, when we're eating, when we're just relaxing, right? Quiet breathing is called eupnea. So eu meaning good, right? Dyspnea is when you have disordered breathing. So in quiet breathing, we have inspiration and expiration. And inspiration and expiration, you can see here, only requires the diaphragmatic muscle to actually work. So in inspiration, the diaphragm contracts, the thoracic cavity becomes larger, and because Boyle's law is in effect, when volume increases, pressure drops. So pressure in the lungs, in the alveoli, drops below atmospheric pressure. Air moves from high to low. So air moves from inside the lungs, from outside the lungs, from the atmosphere into the lungs, until alveolar pressure is equal to atmospheric pressure. And when that happens, then movement of air into the lungs stops. With expiration, what happens is the diaphragm relaxes. Elastic recoil occurs passively, and when the diaphragm relaxes, then the thoracic cavity gets smaller. So the volume of the thoracic cavity goes down. When volume goes down, pressure goes up, right? Inversely proportional. And so what happens is then at this point, the alveolar pressure is greater than the atmospheric pressure. And so air goes from inside the lungs to outside of the body until alveolar pressure is equal to atmospheric pressure. And then when that happens, then you get another cycle where the diaphragm then contracts and you go from here to there to here to there, right? And that's a respiratory cycle. Forced breathing is called hyperpnea because it's breathing at a higher level. And so what happens with this is the diaphragm works similar to how the diaphragm works in quiet breathing, but it also involves other accessory muscles. And so in forceful expiration, you not only have contraction of the diaphragm, but you have contraction of these muscles that are in yellow. You don't have to memorize them. But the end product of forceful inspiration with the contraction of all these muscles is that the chest cavity gets much bigger in size than it does with quiet breathing. And so when thoracic volume is increased further, then alveolar pressure is much lower than it happens during quiet breathing. And so there's more of a difference between atmospheric pressure and alveolar pressure. And so what happens is you have more air going in from the external environment to the lungs. Forced expiration is when you have relaxation of the diaphragm, relaxation of all these muscles, as well as contraction of the intercostal muscles on the inside, so internal intercostals. And the intercostal muscles are found between ribs, right? So it's called this thing is called the costal part of the ribs, and so intercostals are short muscles that are found between one rib to the other. And so when the internal intercostals contract and the abdominal muscles contract, what happens is thoracic volume decreases much smaller than it does in quiet breathing. And so you have more of a pressure difference between the alveolar pressure as well as the atmospheric pressure. And so alveolar pressure increases to a level much higher than it does with quiet breathing. And so you have more air leaving the lungs to enter into the atmosphere during forced expiration, right? So forced expiration and quiet expiration, there's just more happening with forced breathing. In terms of the control of breathing, we've got the ventilation control centers. And so what we have over here is those receptors that that have an input as to the rate of breathing as well as the depth of breathing. So some of the inputs into the ventilation control centers are listed over here. So basically we've got chemoreceptors in the brainstem, in the aorta, and in the carotid, right? So it monitors the concentration, the partial pressure of CO2, carbon dioxide, of oxygen, as well as pH in the brain, in the blood coming out of the heart, and in the blood going to the brain. Right, so we've got central chemoreceptors that are in the brainstem, and we've got peripheral chemoreceptors outside of the central nervous system in the aorta and in the carotid arteries. We also have the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus monitors what's happening emotionally and also monitors body temperature. So it is it receives a lot of input from various different parts of the central nervous system. We also have proprioceptors. So proprioceptors monitor body position as well as joint position. So it tells you whether different limbs are moving fast or not at all. We also have stretch receptors in the lungs and the thorax itself. It gets triggered if the lungs are overinflated to actually protect the lungs. We've got cortical areas in the brain, in the cerebral cortex, that control voluntary breathing. And we've got pulmonary irritant receptors that protect the respiratory zones where air goes in, the respiratory zones from foreign material, right? So you've got all these 6 different types of sensory inputs going into the ventilation control centers in the next slide that basically monitor what's happening in and around that individual. The ventilation control centers are found, as it says over here, in the brainstem, in the medulla oblongata, as well as in the pons. And you've got one in the medulla, one in the pons, and both of them help to control the rate as well as the depth of breathing. So in the medulla, we've got the ventral respiratory group that is located in front of the dorsal respiratory group. So as you can see here, the ventral respiratory group generates the breathing rhythm. It's involved in forceful breathing, whereas the dorsal respiratory group is the one that helps to contract the diaphragm and external intercostals, and these are involved in enlarging the volume of the thoracic cavity, and because it's involved in that, it's involved in dropping the pressure in the alveoli, and therefore involved in causing inspiration. In the pons, we have the pontine respiratory group comprising of the pneumotaxic center as well as the apneustic center. So the pneumotaxic center are help to control the DRG neurons to allow relaxation after inspiration, because when you breathe in, you need to stop, right, at some point so that you don't breathe more air in, controls the overall rate, and the apneustic pressure center again stimulate the DRG neurons to start breathing again. So it's called the apneustic center because apnea is when breathing stops. And so if the apneustic center triggers the depth of inspiration, right? Because with sleep apnea, breathing stops. So the apneustic center then triggers breathing to start again. So we've done ventilation, we've done control, we've done input. So now we're going to look at gas exchange and respiration. So the purpose of having air coming in and out of the lungs is so that carbon dioxide and oxygen can be exchanged at the respiratory membrane. When you look over here, what you can see here is that in terms of the composition of gases in the atmosphere over here versus gases in the alveoli, you can see that it totals up to the same number. But what you can see here is that the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli, air, is less than that in the atmospheric air, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is greater in the alveolar air compared to the atmospheric air, right? You can also see the partial pressure of water is also greater in the alveolar air compared to the atmospheric air. So what happens? What does this all mean? So what it means is that in the alveolar air, the air that's there is humidified, right? Because the pressure in the partial pressure of water is much greater in the alveolar air compared to the atmospheric air. And what you can see here, I'm just going to go back, is that with the partial pressure of CO2 being higher in the alveolar air compared to the atmospheric air, is that then CO2 actually enters from the blood to the alveoli at that level. And so that's why there's more CO2 in the alveolar air compared to in the atmospheric air. And again, with oxygen, there's in the alveoli, what happens is oxygen enters into the pulmonary capillaries from the alveoli air. And so then the partial pressure of oxygen is lower there too. So in terms of gas exchange, the movement of gas A is independent of the movement of gas B. So they're two independent entities. They move according to their own pressure gradient. So if you look over here, the gases will move from an area of its higher pressure to an area of its lower pressure. So when we look at gas A, right, the blue dots, there are more blue dots outside compared to inside of the blood vessels. And so gas A would move from outside into the capillaries, from outside to blood. When we look at gas B, the yellow circles, we can see that there's many more particles of gas B inside of the blood compared to outside. And so it will move down its concentration gradient. So it will move from inside blood, inside of the blood vessels, to the external environment, right? So both these gases move in different or opposite directions because what it's doing is it's just following the pressure gradient of its own particular gas, right? So we get Dalton's law, right? And Dalton's law says any single gas moves in response to its own pressure gradient, independent of what else is going on about it. So that's what Dalton's law says. Henry's law says that once they move into something that contains a liquid, some of it enters into the liquid. And so we talk about the solubility of gases, and basically the solubility of glass, how much gas is soluble in a liquid, depends on its solubility as well as the overall partial pressure of that gas. And again, it's independent of any other gases in that mixture. So different gases have different solubility. So carbon dioxide is 20 times more soluble than oxygen in fluid, in water. So 20 times more carbon dioxide is able to be carried as a soluble gas in interstitial fluid as well as in plasma compared to oxygen. And then we've seen Boyle's law before, where we talk about the volume is inversely proportional to the pressure. In terms of gas exchange or respiration, respiration occurs in two main locations in the body. One is in the pulmonary capillaries, where gases are exchanged between the pulmonary capillaries and the external environment of the alveolar air. And because it's gas exchange between the external environment and the capillaries, it's called external respiration. And internal respiration happens inside the body in the systemic capillaries, where you have gas exchange between the systemic capillaries into the interstitial fluid and the body cells, right? So what happens is in external respiration, what happens is you've got a lot of oxygen moving from the alveolar air into either being dissolved in plasma or bound to hemoglobin in the red blood cells. And you've got a lot of carbon dioxide moving from the blood vessels into the alveolar air. And you can see here carbon dioxide exists as three different states. One is that some carbon dioxide is dissolved in plasma. Some carbon dioxide gets converted to bicarb. And some carbon dioxide are associated or bound to hemoglobin, right? So whichever way carbon dioxide is transported in blood, most of the carbon dioxide in the pulmonary capillaries leave the blood to enter into the alveolar air. So that's external respiration. In internal respiration, what happens is the carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product by cells. And so it's produced in the cell, it goes in the interstitial fluid. And what you can see here is that there is a mass movement of carbon dioxide from the cells via the interstitial fluid into the blood vessels. So it either is then carried as being soluble in blood or bound to hemoglobin, or is transported as bicarb. And then you've got a lot of oxygen moving from being bound to hemoglobin of red blood cells into the interstitial fluid and then directly into the tissue cells. And then a very small amount of oxygen that's transported as being dissolved in plasma also moves in the same direction. So from the plasma into the interstitial fluid and then into the tissue cells. And so this movement of oxygen from the blood into the cells and carbon dioxide from the cells into the blood is called internal respiration. So when we look at the process of external respiration, what happens is that if you look here and you look at the partial pressure of oxygen as well as carbon dioxide, what you can see here is the partial pressure of oxygen is higher in the alveolar air compared to the pulmonary capillaries. And so oxygen will go from a level of higher pressure to lower pressure. So oxygen moves from the alveolar air into the pulmonary capillaries, right? And so you've got these two big purple arrows moving oxygen from the alveolar air into the pulmonary capillaries. When we look at carbon dioxide, what we see is that carbon dioxide levels are higher in the pulmonary capillaries than they are in the alveolar air. So carbon dioxide then moves from higher pressure to lower pressure. So carbon dioxide moves from the pulmonary capillary into the alveolar air. So you see these big black arrows moving CO2 from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveolar air. And this happens with both gases until the partial pressure of the both gases in the alveolar air is equivalent to the pressure of the gases in the pulmonary capillaries. Internal respiration occurs between systemic capillaries and body cells. So again, what happens is, if you look over here, what happens is oxygen moves into from the alveolar air to the pulmonary capillaries until it is equivalent to, say, 100. The partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeters mercury, and then and then the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is equivalent to 40 millimeters mercury. And so then the blood then goes from the lungs to the body cells. And so you've got these two values, right, from the previous slide. And then what happens in the between the systemic capillaries and the body cells is that body tissues, you can see here, partial pressure of oxygen is 40 compared to 100 in the systemic capillaries. And so oxygen moves from the systemic capillaries into the body tissues, right? This big purple arrows. And then if you look at the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, it's higher in the body tissues because carbon dioxide is generated by the body cells as a waste product. And so then CO2 moves from the body tissues into the systemic capillaries. And that continues on until the pressures of both gases in both locations is equivalent. And then it stops, and then the blood and the red blood cells then move on, gets collected by the systemic venous system, and goes to the heart through the right atrium, right ventricle, and then in the lungs. And then you repeat what happens in the previous slide with external respiration. So it's a cycle here. In terms of oxygen transport and the value of hemoglobin in red blood cells, remember that the red blood cells, mature red blood cells, only have one type of organelle, one type of protein, and the protein that it has no organelles. So the only protein that's present in red blood cells is hemoglobin. And you can, I don't know whether you remember, there's like 250 million hemoglobin molecules in a single red blood cell, right? And the importance of hemoglobin in red blood cells and in plasma cannot be understated. Because if you look at just the watery portion of blood, you look at plasma, in the absence of red blood cells, it can only transport 0.3 mils of oxygen per 100 mils of plasma. Not that it means anything, but if you look at the amount of oxygen that whole blood with red blood cells can transport, it's 20 mils of oxygen per 100 mils of whole blood. And so you can see that almost all of the body's oxygen is transported in blood as being bound to the hemoglobin of red blood cells. And so you even see this, right? So if you look at this graph down here, what you can see here is this black line over here is the total amount of oxygen that's found in blood. But if you look at the amount of oxygen that's bound to hemoglobin, it's about, well, to be precise using these numbers, is about 98.5% of oxygen is transported in blood as being bound to hemoglobin. Only 1.5% of oxygen is soluble in plasma, and so if you don't have enough red blood cells, if you don't have enough hemoglobin, then the ability for blood to transport oxygen decreases dramatically. So again, so you've got hemoglobin over here, and you can see each hemoglobin can bind to a maximum of 4 oxygen molecules. And the 4 oxygen molecules, each molecule is bound to the iron that's connected to the heme of each of these polypeptide chains. So hemoglobin is made out of 2 beta. Adult hemoglobin is made out of 2 beta chains and 2 alpha chains. Each of these chain has a heme protein connected to it, and each of these heme is bound to an iron, and each of these ions can bind to 1 oxygen molecule. So each hemoglobin can bind to a maximum of 4 oxygen molecules, and when all of these 4 oxygen binding sites are filled for all of the red blood cells, then it's called 100% hemoglobin saturation. Normally, we've got anywhere between 95 to 99% hemoglobin saturation. So about 95 to 99% of these binding sites of each hemoglobin molecule, it has got an oxygen connected to it. Another feature of this graph on the bottom right-hand corner is this. So at the level of the alveoli, in the pulmonary capillaries of the lungs, the saturation of oxygen and hemoglobin reaches 100%, right? So this is percent saturation. It reaches 100%. But when we're resting, when we're not doing anything, when we're passively breathing, we don't require much oxygen. What happens is then the tissues at rest then bring the oxygen saturation down to 75%. What does 75% mean in terms of oxygen bound to hemoglobin? It means that at rest, we only use up 1 out of 4 possible oxygen molecules, right? And so that leaves another 3 out of the 4 available for when we're under stress, for when we need more oxygen, for when we're running away from the bear, when we're exercising, when we're doing stuff, right? And so it's really important that at rest, we have this oxygen reserve for when we need more oxygen. In terms of how strongly oxygen binds to hemoglobin, what happens is that it depends on the partial pressure of oxygen. So the partial pressure of oxygen is high in pulmonary capillaries of the lungs, and that makes more oxygen bind to the heme of the hemoglobin. So when the red blood cells go in through the pulmonary capillaries, what happens is the high partial pressure of oxygen causes the first oxygen to bind to hemoglobin. That causes a change in the hemoglobin compound to actually make the second oxygen molecule to bind more readily to it, and that then causes easier binding of the third and the fourth oxygen molecules to the hemoglobin. And so pretty much as blood goes through the pulmonary capillaries, we can reach 100% saturation. All right, so it's easy. So basically, when there's lots of oxygen around, oxygen just hops onto the hemoglobin train. partial pressure is lower of oxygen is lower in the systemic capillaries. So what happens is that it causes oxygen to bind, to dissociate easily from hemoglobin. So because the partial pressure is low, then the first oxygen molecule dissociates from the hemoglobin. It causes a change in the hemoglobin molecule so that it gets rid of the second oxygen if needed more readily, right? And so what happens is if that is the systemic capillaries at highly active tissues like muscles, it uses oxygen more rapidly. And when it uses more oxygen more rapidly to get rid of the first one, it requires the first one and also the second one. It's easier once the first oxygen molecule is let go for the second one and subsequent oxygen molecules to let go, right? Whereas tissues with lower metabolic rates like adipose or fat tissue use less oxygen, so the partial pressure of oxygen doesn't drop as much, and so less oxygen then dissociates or leaves the hemoglobin molecule. Some factors that affect the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve are the Bohr effect and higher temperatures. So the Bohr effect has to do with pH. So basically, pun intended, so basically if the blood is more acidic, has got a lower pH, it causes oxygen to be dissociated easier from hemoglobin. And when you think about it, pH will drop when CO2 levels increase, because as CO2 levels increase, hydrogen levels increase. And as hydrogen levels increase, pH drops. And CO2 levels increase with active muscles, right? And active muscles need more oxygen, so it actually helps. So as pH drops because the tissue is more active, then what happens is oxygen is more likely to leave the hemoglobin molecules to be used by the cells that need it, right? Whereas if you have a higher, more alkaline pH, then it's the opposite happens. In terms of temperature, again, when you look at the exercise example, if you're exercising, you're generating more body heat as a byproduct of exercise. And so with an increase in temperature, when we move the curve to the right, it means that the hemoglobin will release oxygen more readily. Again, when you're exercising, you need more oxygen, and so it's good for hemoglobin to actually drop its link with oxygen so that you can actually use it in your more active tissue, right? So again, in both these graphs, if the normal graph in pink shifts to the right, that means oxygen is dumped from the blood more readily from hemoglobin, and if it moves to the left, that means it's dumped less readily. So oxygen is bound more strongly to hemoglobin if the curve moves to the left versus it moving to the right. Let's do a brief talk about fetal hemoglobin. So again, with fetal hemoglobin, in the fetus, what happens is that the hemoglobin is different. So instead of the fetal hemoglobin containing 2 beta and 2 alpha chains, fetal hemoglobin contains 2 alpha and 2 gamma chains. And you remember in the fetus doesn't breathe. And so there's no gas exchange at the lungs. And so the gas exchange happens at the level of the placenta. So in the placenta, we've got the maternal blood supply over here, and then we've got the fetal blood supply being supplied by the umbilical vein and umbilical arteries. And so what happens is the umbilical arteries leaves the fetal heart to go to the placenta, and in the process, what happens is that it carries increasingly deoxygenated blood. And then in the placenta, what happens is oxygen is taken, moves from the maternal blood supply to the fetal blood supply, and carbon dioxide moves from the fetal blood supply to the maternal blood supply, right? So the umbilical vein transports blood from the placenta to the fetus, and so the blood is oxygenated because it picks up oxygen from the placenta, whereas the umbilical arteries carry deoxygenated blood and to the placenta, and the placenta is where it picks up the oxygen. In terms of the pressure gradient of oxygen at the placenta, it's much lower versus the respiratory membrane when the fetus is born. So when we look at the pressure difference between the alveolar air and the pulmonary capillaries, it's 104 versus 40. So there's a greater pressure gradient compared to the pressure gradient between the maternal blood and the fetal blood. So if you look over here, the maternal blood partial pressure is between 35 to 50. Fetal blood is 20. So much smaller pressure difference, which means that it's harder and slower for oxygen to move from the maternal blood supply to the fetal blood supply in the placenta. And that's why we need a special hemoglobin called fetal hemoglobin. Because what happens is fetal hemoglobin will bind to oxygen with a stronger affinity. Remember what I said before in the previous slide? If the graph moves to the left, it means that the association between the gas and the hemoglobin is stronger. And so you can see fetal hemoglobin has a stronger association. With oxygen compared to adult hemoglobin with oxygen. And so what happens is oxygen is snatched from the maternal blood supply from the adult hemoglobin, and it moves and binds more strongly to the fetal hemoglobin in the fetal blood. So I thought that was interesting. When we look at carbon dioxide and how it's transported in blood, you can see that it's transported in 3 different ways. One is that about 10% of carbon dioxide is transported as dissolved in plasma, in the watery part of blood, right, in the yellow here. 70% is transported as bicarb using this reaction over here. And then the other 70% there, and then the other 20% is transported as being bound to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin doesn't only bind to oxygen, it also binds to carbon dioxide, right? But when we look at carbon dioxide that's bound to hemoglobin, only about 20% of carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin as a total, but 98.5% of oxygen in the blood is bound to hemoglobin. So it's a different kind of relationship with hemoglobin that the two gases have, right? So you've got here small amount bound to hemoglobin. Most of carbon dioxide is transported as bicarb, and then a very small amount is dissolved in plasma, but it's 10% of carbon dioxide is transported as dissolved in plasma compared to 1.5% of oxygen. Because carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin, we also have what's called the Haldane effect, and the Haldane effect is talks about how easily carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin, and the ease at which carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin depends on the partial pressure of oxygen. And again, it makes sense. Let's go through this. When hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen, it does not bind readily to CO2. And that makes sense because when hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen, that happens in the lungs, in the pulmonary capillaries. And also in the lungs, in the pulmonary capillaries, that's when we want carbon dioxide to leave the blood to go into, to be expired, to enter into the alveoli cell, right? So as oxygen moves into the blood and is bound more strongly to hemoglobin, that then creates this link where hemoglobin dumps CO2 more readily, right? So carbon dioxide hemoglobin dissociation occurs more easily. Carbon dioxide then diffuses across the respiratory air into the alveolar air to be breathed out. In the systemic circulation, in the systemic capillaries, what happens is the partial pressure of oxygen is lower, less oxygen binds to hemoglobin, and so hemoglobin binds more readily to CO2. And again, that makes sense. So you've got the red blood cell over here with hemoglobin over here. What happens at the systemic capillaries is we want oxygen to leave the blood to enter into the body cells. And at the same time, we want carbon dioxide to leave the cells to enter into the blood. And as I stated before, a proportion of the carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin. So this makes it easier for the cells to enter the blood and to bind to hemoglobin, right? So what you can see over here is that in the systemic capillaries, it's easier for CO2 to bind to hemoglobin. In the pulmonary capillaries, it's harder for the CO2 to bind to hemoglobin because there's more oxygen there. And so this helps with the gas exchange at both ends of the continuum.